So last time we were talking about things that cause evolution, that sort of upset equilibrium or Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium that would cause a population to not stay the same over a period of time. And so kind of summarizing that, keep in mind that natural selection of everything we've talked about, mutations, genetic drift, the founder effect, migration, gene flow, the only one that specifically makes organisms better fit for their environment is natural selection. That one specifically is where the environment is sort of determining what traits survive, and you're going to end up with organisms that are better fit for their environment. All the other mechanisms we talked about, genetic drift is where the population changes by random chance because of a natural disaster, because the population is too small, because of the founder effect. Mutations are random. They're not necessarily good or bad. They might be good, they might be bad, they might have no effect at all. You know, migration, things like that. But natural selection specifically contributes to making a population more adapted to the environment. And keep in mind, don't forget about fitness. That fitness is the contribution an individual makes to the gene pool in the next generation. If you live a really long time and you don't have any kids, then technically you don't have a high fitness biologically because you didn't pass your genes on. So we're talking specifically about the ability to pass your traits on to the next generation. And so survival of the fittest is not exactly right. It's not just that you survive, but it's also that you pass your genes on. And keep in mind that fitness is not just being strong, or being fast. It's whatever makes you have the ability to survive longer and have more offspring. So you're successfully passing your genes to the next generation. Okay, how does natural selection specifically change a population? Well, there's three general kinds of natural selection. We're going to zip through them very quickly. You did this in the homework as well. Stabilizing selection is where intermediate or being average is best. Directional selection is where a population, like one extreme, one phenotype is the best, and everything sort of shifts towards that. And disruptive is where things sort of go in different directions. Like if you have two phenotypes, light and dark, being light and dark are both good, but being average is the worst. So let me show you a couple of scenarios. In scenario one, darker mice, imagine that darker mice can camouflage from some kind of a predator. So we start with a population that's got mice that are dark, light, and average in color. But over time, if the light ones are getting eaten more, generation after generation goes by, notice how this bell curve sort of shifts towards one direction. In this case, in this second one, you have birds with larger bodies, and they survive better in the cold. So we start with sort of an average population of birds, but after a really cold winter, only the larger ones survived. And if that's a genetic trait, being able to grow to a bigger size, then that would be passed on to the next generation. Here's our example of stabilizing selection. So imagine that being a really light mouse or a really dark mouse, both of those make you more likely to get caught by predators, then we're going to favor the average size mice. And in this case, what they're showing is babies, the mortality rate. So this is the mortality rate for babies who are very, very light in weight. And it actually increases a bit if babies are too big. And so what we find is average birth weight babies are favored. So anytime the middle is favored, that's going to be stabilizing selection. And then this last one, sometimes this one's hard to wrap your head around. But imagine you have a scenario where you have a patchy environment. And some areas of the environment, there's like really dark ground, and then there's light sand. And then there's dark ground, but then there's another area of light sand. And your environment looks like this. Every area in this environment is either dark or light. There's no like medium. Well, what's going to happen here is it's going to be bad to be a medium gray colored mouse. If you're a light mouse, you'll be okay in the light areas. If you're a dark mouse, you'll be okay in the dark areas. But if you're medium colored, there's nowhere for you to go. And this can actually cause or lead to divergent evolution, where two groups sort of separate, and ultimately, over many, many, many years, they may even become separate species. And that's what we see. And the same thing here. They're talking about these finches, and they have a variety of beak sizes, but these beaks are adapted to soft seeds. These beaks are adapted for harder seeds, and having a medium-sized beak, it's not really good for either one. It's, you're better to have a really hard beak or a really soft beak. I mean, a beak for really hard seeds or soft seeds. And so over time, who survives? These two groups, but the intermediate ones disappear. So that is called disruptive selection. It can lead to species sort of diverging. This is an example in the snakes of disruptive selection. So if these all came from a common ancestor, but through over time, they diverged into these different groups. So each one of these is uniquely colored for its environment. And in some cases, if they do breed with each other, the hybrid, the color that it comes out, doesn't help it survive. It's going to even further enforce that these sort of diverge into different groups. Okay, sexual selection, there's actually two kinds of sexual selection. There's intra-sexual selection and inter-sexual selection. And this has to do with males and females having certain characteristics that help them to mate more often and have more offspring. So intersexual, let's start with intrasexual selection. This is where individuals compete with one another. Individuals of the same sex compete for mates. So, for example, you may have deer that have fights with one another. They hit their antlers together and they're fighting over the females. That would be intrasexual selection. And the one that has the longer antlers or is the strongest or the most aggressive or whatever, they're going to be more likely to win that battle, mate with the females, and the traits they carry are going to get passed on. Another type of sexual selection is intersexual selection. So this is between the sexes. So this isn't two males fighting over a female. This is where the female is being picky. Usually it's females, by the way. If you wonder why are females the ones that are usually the choosy ones, is because in most species, the females are the ones that have to carry the offspring and oftentimes offer extended parental care. So it's sort of built in evolutionarily that by them choosing the best males, the most healthy males with the best genes, they're going to have the best chance of having healthy offspring. Because why waste their time if they're going to lay eggs and they're going to hatch into baby birds that are not going to survive because they picked a bad male? So it tends to be sort of built in. And this can include, for example, females in peacocks. This can lead to what's called a sexual dimorphism, where the females and males look very different from each other, and the males become ridiculously showy, like in the peacocks, and the females are choosy. Now, another reason, by the way, that females oftentimes are the drab-colored ones is because, again, if they're taking care of the offspring, it's going to make more sense because they're going to be stuck with eggs or babies that they're going to need to be camouflaged. So a lot of times, if the females are the ones taking care of offspring, they're going to tend to be kind of drab in color. The males can afford to be more colorful because they're not stuck in one place. They can move around more. So this would be intrasexual to moose or deer, elk, it says, fighting over females. So this is within one sex. The males are fighting each other. This is intersexual between the sexes. The females are picking the showiest males in this case. All right. This is just an example, just a reminder. We already talked about the pesticide example. Antibiotics are the same, can cause the same problem. So remember, it's not that antibiotics turn bacteria resistant. That is a misconception. The resistant bacteria are around. Mutations arise all the time that create bacteria that might be resistant to a particular antibiotic. And that's not going to be a big deal, except the more we expose bacteria to antibiotics, the more of the non-resistant ones we kill, the more space we make available for the resistant ones to take over. So 3 problems that contribute to this. Number 1, doctors overprescribing antibiotics. You go to the doctor, you say, I don't feel good, and you want to walk out of there with a pill, and that way you feel like you didn't waste your money. But if you don't actually have a bacterial infection, the antibiotic's not doing anything for you, and you're still now exposing bacteria to this antibiotic, making it more likely if there's any resistant ones, they're going to become more common. Second, if you stop taking your antibiotics early. And a third one you may not be aware of, a lot of livestock, chickens, cows, are given antibiotics just in their food as a preventative measure, not even after they're sick. And so we're just spreading these antibiotics through the animals, and by doing that, again, exposing more and more bacteria to them, which is any bacteria that are resistant are now going to become more and more common. Okay, and this is just explaining that a lot of deaths, 23,000 deaths back in, this is all the way back in 2013, this is a little bit of old data, but the idea is that, there's a lot of deaths from these microorganisms that are resistant to drugs. There's at least 15 that are serious health risks. You've probably heard of MRSA, for example, methicillin-resistant staph. And so these are bacteria that are resistant to pretty much all the antibiotics we have, and so therefore it's very hard to treat infections that are caused by them. So again, keep in mind, antibiotics have not created resistant bacteria. They have contributed to increasing how common the resistant bacteria are. And this is just showing some diseases and how much resistance we're seeing with different types of bacteria and diseases. Again, a lot of these are not treated as often with antibiotics, so we don't have as much resistance. The more antibiotics we prescribe, the more the resistance sort of comes out. Those bacteria become more and more common. A couple more things. Balancing selection. This is where sort of if there's too much of one phenotype, it becomes a problem. And so it's not that average is favored or anything in particular is favored, but it needs to have a good balance or else things sort of go south. So it's sort of a natural selection that maintains all the varieties because that's the best situation. And the last one here, heterozygote advantage. This is a specific type of selection where being heterozygous is beneficial. And an example of this they always use in textbooks is sickle cell anemia and malaria. So sickle cell anemia is a bad disease. You don't want to have it. If you're big B, you would be normal. If you're big B, little b, you are a carrier of sickle cell. You don't have, I believe there's some mild symptoms, but it's very, very mild. And if you're little b, you have full-fledged sickle cell. Now, here's the problem. If you have full-fledged sickle cell and you live in a remote area where you never get any medical treatment at all, you are likely to die young and not pass that gene on, because sickle cell can be deadly with no medical intervention, although people that have it in our country survive and live fairly normal lives. But in Africa, in certain areas, it turns out that people who are heterozygous carriers, so they don't really have sickle cell, but they carry a gene for it, it makes them resistant to malaria, which is carried by mosquitoes. And what we find is that areas of Africa in particular, where there's a high incidence of malaria, the dotted areas, we also see a high incidence of carriers for sickle cell. Why? Because if you don't carry the gene and you get malaria, malaria can be deadly. Again, with no medical treatment, 80 to 100% mortality in some cases from malaria. So this would be bad. And if you have full-fledged sickle cell, you're probably not going to survive. You're not going to do really well either. So what's the best scenario? To be a carrier, to be heterozygous. All right. And again, why don't we end up with perfect organisms? Remember, evolution is limited by what traits are in the population. It's not like, oh, it would be really cool if we could evolve wheels as feet and then we would be perfect. And one day that's going to happen because that's what we're doing. We're heading towards perfection. It doesn't work like that. Natural selection acts on existing variations. So you have to already have the traits there, number one. Number two, evolution is limited, again, to historical constraints, meaning what has already appeared, existing structures. And then if the environment changes, we may see structures become more or less common, but we're not going to necessarily see brand new traits appear just because we need them. It doesn't work like that. Mutations are completely random. Also keep in mind, adaptations are compromises. In other words, yeah, we walk upright, and that makes us really good at doing some things, but it makes us worse at doing other things. We don't run nearly as fast as a leopard that's on all fours. So everything is a compromise. Having certain organs bigger or smaller makes us better at some things, but worse at others. So we're not necessarily working towards perfection. And so evolution comes about by a mixture of random chance, mutations, natural selection, and the environment. And the environment can change. So, what's good to have today may not be a good trait to have tomorrow. So keep that in mind. And this is just a good example, that we have flexible limbs and joints, but we're prone to sprains and torn ligaments and things. That's part of that compromise. We're good at certain things, but the way that our bodies are structured, we're not good at everything. And so the more athletic things that we do, we may be put in situations where our body is not in the best scenario for the way that we're designed. All right, and that's evolution.